Hello and welcome, stargazers. This is APM, your intrepid star guide, and this is Outlaw Astrology Podcast. And this is a podcast on which we discuss ongoing astrology as a spiritual path that allows us to live by our own code, so the outlaw archetype. And so today what we're going to talk about is archetypal astrology. This is going to be the intro, the basics, and you're going to get acquainted to its connection to what we call psychological astrology, which is what some astrologers refer to as modern astrology. Okay? Before we get to that, if you like my astro flow, please like, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, there's a newsletter called the Daily Stargazer. We have a free and paid version. Please feel free to check that out in the show notes, as the link will be provided. And lastly, today we're not going to be doing anything too heavy, so just sit back, enjoy, get yourself a nice cuppa. If you want to take notes, feel free to pause as you like. And now, onward. Alrighty, so what we're going to do first is we're talking about archetypal astrology. And as a neurospicy person, my journey is always ongoing. To just a little more about me in that, I am diagnosed as an HSP person. I have been diagnosed as a child with dyslexia, and those are two of my major lifetime concerns. And then as I got older, found out, more about some of my other neurospicy tendencies, which we will discuss perhaps at a later time. So what we're going to be talking about in this series, as I said, is archetypal astrology and what that basically means. So archetypal astrology comes from Carl G. Jung. That's Carl Gustav Jung's universal patterns concept. So what I'm going to do first is present just briefly, because I recall mentioning it in previous episodes, but we're going to talk about, just briefly, give you a bio about Carl Jung, so you'll have a better understanding about him as I talk here. So it's Carl Gustav Jung, who was born 1875, July 26 at 7:29 p.m. in Kesswell, Switzerland. He was an associate and mentee of Sigmund Freud. And at some point, they parted ways because it was the late 19th century and psychology was starting to be all the rage. It wasn't the rage yet, but there were many different forms of psychology in development that we now take for granted, and Carl Jung's style is one of them. So let's get down to our sacred trinity. So the sun is in Leo. That's fixed fire. The moon is in Taurus, that's fixed earth. And the ascendant is in Aquarius, fixed air. That basically means his sun is in the 7th house, his moon is in the 4th, and his ascendant obviously on the cusp of the 1st house. He is a last quarter square lunation, so someone who's a bit more cautious, someone who's always assessing, questioning. Last quarter moons are like first quarter moons in that they are crises of consciousness, except last quarter moons come at it with a bit more caution. First quarter moons would be more of a devil-may-care attitude, so last quarter, third quarter moons right before a waxing crescent and right before a waning crescent and right after a waning gibbous moon. And so somebody a bit more cautious. Now his chart tends toward is 50% fire and 50% fixed, so this is very Leo energy. Now, fixed energy is determined, it's productive, it's capable of following through reliably. Fire energy inspires, it drives, and it creates with enthusiasm. He's got a lot of squares in his chart, so there is a lot of a desire to resolve things, because squares, archetypally, are Mars energy. And that energy is challenging, but challenges seek resolution. So this is troubleshooting energy, okay? And let me look, because I like to check out declinations to see if anything's out of bounds. It's a favorite thing of mine. His Mars is out of bounds at 27 degrees south, 53 minutes and 26 seconds. And his Lilith is at 28 degrees south, 12 minutes and 34 seconds. When it comes to his hemisphere analysis, it tends toward evenly keeled between south and north. The south, planets in the south tend to be conscious and objective, meaning they're outwardly focused. They are, your conscious mind, your neocortex, the youngest part of the brain, very aware, very on your mind. It doesn't mean it's better, it just means that the focus will be out there and it'll be very top of mind consciously, whereas the planets in the north tend to be what we consider to be subconscious and subjective, meaning they're more personal and they are lived from the inside out, whereas south planets are from the outside in. He's got quite a bit of Western emphasis over Eastern. Eastern planets tend to be output streams. They're asserting their energy onto the others and onto their environments, where planets in the West are more of an input stream. They receive energy from the others and the environment, which makes sense. He is a pioneer in psychology. And lastly, quadrant hemisphere. The biggest hemisphere would be the third quadrant, which starts with ascendant, and that is communion and receptivity to others. He did study people. He did study people for a living. By the way, the word psychology is based off the Greek word, and that word means soul. So it's basically a study of the soul, as it were. And someone who studies the soul would need to work with others, which is very seventh house orientated, and that is where his sun happens to be. So self-expression, being seen and heard, and also being playful and creative, which is how we get two archetypes. Lastly, that third quadrant, as I said, starts with ascendant, and the second quadrant would be the secondary of the largest of the two. It's the second largest, and it starts with the inner heaven, or the IC Imonqueli, and represents inner empowerment and rootedness. You'd kind of want that if you were a psychologist, a pioneering psychologist. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of Carl Jung's chart. The chart ruler is Uranus in Leo, and he has a lot of energy in his seventh house. It is all lit up with Vesta, devotion, so devoted to play, to creativity, which is how we get to archetypes. That's how he got there. He brings that creative energy to his relationships, to his clients, to however he chooses to act, whereas Freud tended to be more about the past, how much the past has an effect. How much does nurture have an effect on people's natures? And does the nature out itself regardless of nurture? So he's the one that had the ideal, Freud, that how you felt about your mom or your father, or what happened in your childhood, had a great presence in your present life. Whereas Jung had tended to be of a different bent on that, a different mind on that. So, those are some of the archetypes, that's his information. Now, these are some of the archetypes that Jung tended to think about. These are the ones that he mentioned and worked with in most. So I'm going to give them in a list format quite quickly, and I will give you keywords and then we will move on. So the first grouping is the wise old man. Knowledge and morality, the persona social identity, anima and animus, which is the gender balance. That's where you'll see the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, if you are of the sort that does gender binaries in your spiritual practice. So this is, and he was, because he's the one that invited spiritual practice, and invited magic, myth, and folklore into his psychological practice when working with clients and with working himself. He actually had something called the Red Book, which is where he made pictures, notes of things that was going on in his inner world. He was very much engaged and interacting all the time with his inner world. The second group is the trickster. That's chaos and deception would be the keywords. The mother, nurturing and instinct. And the third would be the child, innocence and loyalty. Then there's the shadow self, darker impulses. The self, cohesive identity. The hero, bravery and strength. Group 4 has the explorer, a desire for freedom. The outlaw, rebellion against norms. The lover, passion and intimacy. Followed by group 5, the everyman, the everyday individual. The ruler, authority and control, and the artist, creative expression. So those are some of the forms, the archetypes, that you will often see when in connection to Jung and his work. And they will turn up in daily life. So here's an example. The magician, when we promote a cause that matters to us. Because we got to convince people. We got to put it out there to people to inspire them to be involved. Or the teacher, when we teach what we know very well to others. Or the innovator, where all systems need to change from time to time, and so the innovator is always innovating systems and scrapping old ones to be more efficient or simply to be more creative. And that's the basis of creativity, is being able to innovate ever so often. So archetypal astrology is bridging psychology and astrology. It is taking these deeper, magical, mystical forms that Jung popularized. Now, the thing is, did he invent them? I don't believe so. I believe these forms always exist in some form or another. They simply may not have been organized the way he organized them. I would say he popularized them. It's very difficult to invent anything in this world when we've got tens of thousands of years of culture and history and myth and folklore, some of which we remember and some of which we've completely forgotten. So it bridges those gaps when it comes to astrology. Now, some of the archetypes that you will find are planetary ones. So, the sun is the self, okay? So that is an archetype. Mercury is the thinker. Venus, the harmonizer. The moon is the nurturer. Where am I at? Mars is the challenger, the motivator, the defender, the protector. That's the energy. I would say more of a protector and defender. The guardian. It would be a good one for Mars. Jupiter would be the teacher, the mentor, the sage. And Saturn would be the timekeeper, the master, the elder. Uranus is the awakener, the rebel, the visionary. Neptune is the dreamer, the mystic. And Pluto is the bone collector, death itself personified. That's how I see it. The transformer, the alchemist. And to turn back, we've got Chiron, the healer, the maverick, the token, the other. Okay? So those are some of the archetypes that you're going to see for planetary archetypes. You'll even see them in story form on occasion. And so when we're talking about stories, we're talking about the trickster, for example, the crow, the fox, the raven, the coyote, you're often going to see stories about them, particularly in indigenous native cultures to the Americas. You're going to find that those archetypes very prominent. Those are the ones you will see typically in indigenous cultures in the Americas. However, it's not limited to that, because if you look in Africa, you'll find the trickster amongst their archetypes in their stories as well. Tricksters tend to be hard to define. They shapeshift. Their morals are fluid. They are kind of like the magician. They can be shady sometimes. But the death loa, for example, in voodoo or voodoo, and things that come from the rich African cultures in Nigeria and places of that nature, you'll find that the trickster serves a different purpose. It's usually to provide humor or to awaken people. In some cases, in voodoo, there's called the death. I'm not certain how to pronounce this. I think it's Loa, but I could be incorrect. But the death archetypes, the Mama Brigitte and people of that archetypes of that nature, that particular Orisha, that particular Loa, that particular energy or force. They're always poking fun at humans. They think humans take themselves too seriously. That humans are too self-important, and they should laugh at themselves once in a while. And so sometimes a trickster is there to provide humor, to get the human to go, ha ha, that was funny, to laugh at yourself and not take life or yourself too seriously. The other side is that tricksters can be a little on the shady side. Sometimes they're running a scam, they're running a game. You'll find this in Greek mythology. You'll also find it in African mythology. Usually they are playing tricks like the hare in the race between the turtle and the hare. The hare is being a little bit of a trickster. He's like, he's a little self-important and full of himself. That's trickster mage type energy. And he loses the race because he gets overconfident, not because he lacks ability or doesn't have the resources, just he underestimated his opponent. And you find that a lot in different cultures. So, taking this back to archetypal astrology, what we're looking at is less about, it's more about the story and less about being every little detail in the chart. So archetypal astrology doesn't focus on a chart ruler, for example. It does not focus on signs. It does not focus on house placement specifically. Those are two of the major things I've noticed. It does lean toward psychological astrology, but it sees these energies as more archetypal. So whereas astrology, even modern psychological astrology, it tends to be like very specific. It's Mars in Virgo in a trine with Chiron in Taurus, and that energy, the whole package, is what's important. Or Mars in Virgo opposing Chiron in Pisces, or square Chiron in Gemini, or square Chiron in Sagittarius. Okay? These energies, you don't find them focused on to that level in archetypal astrology. Archetypal astrology would be less detailed brushwork, meaning a particular brush that you need really tiny, that you could do very detailed drawing and painting, whereas I would see archetypal astrology as more of a broad brushstroke. So the focus would be less on Mars in Virgo and Chiron in Taurus, and that's a trine. It would be more like, what is Mars and Chiron doing together? What archetype are we illuminating here? Now, in archetypal astrology, and I'm expanding upon it, it's mostly the focus of outer planets, in particular Saturn and Jupiter, going on out. It's not that they don't focus on inner planets. It's just that outer planets have a tendency to shape the expression of inner planets, which is why transits are important. It's what the outer planets are doing that's of most importance, because the inner planets change signs so frequently that their impact is very swift. You don't feel it as strongly, or when you do feel it, it's usually, separating aspect and the energy is declining before you realize anything's going on. Whereas an outer planet, you can definitely feel that energy if you're intuitive and you are more engaged with your intuition. So houses are seen as archetypal because the first house is your identity. The second house is, we're talking about, how would I put this? Because it's a little bit more of a challenge when we're doing houses. The most archetypal house in the chart is the first house. Because everything, all the aspects that we understand are seen from the point of view of the ascendant, wherever it happens to be, usually in the first house. So the aspects going around the chart are from that perspective, because that is considered in traditional astrology and Hellenized astrology to be the most you in the chart, because it changes sign every 2 hours. So the most archetypal point in the chart is that first house, because it is the you of the chart. And the angles, I would say, out of the housing type aspects, I would say the angles tend to be archetypal, because the midheaven is the highest point in the chart, and it's called such because dead center of heaven, but it's also the calling, and calling is an archetypal energy, whereas the opposing point, the imam quelli, would be the personal, the more egoic, the more internalized. So that would be your inner world, which is archetypal, because we don't actually have a world that exists within us per se. It is, archetypes would be simply explained as ways to understand things by giving it a label. So identity, we understand what we're talking about. It makes it easier for us to understand what we're talking about if we say identity, if we say the self, or anything like, or the hero, we understand what we're talking about. So archetypes are a way of giving shape and form to abstractions, because the self, where is the self? The mind, where is the mind? Because the Mercury represents the mind in the chart. And so that's how you interact with that. But if we're looking at, say, Moon and Venus in an aspect, and another curious differentiation about archetypal astrology is also that they don't have all of these five aspects that in detail. It does not matter as much to an archetypal astrologer whether or not this is a trine, a square, or otherwise, merely that these 2 planets, these 2 points are in conversation, and that conversation is the archetypal energy. So we've got Moon and Venus talking in a chart. That's the heart, because I don't see the heart as just the Moon. I don't see the heart as just Venus. It is the 2 interacting together to give you the heart. And if we've got someone who's a visionary, for example, then we're looking at Mercury and Uranus. Mercury and Uranus would be about the unexpected, the unconventional. And if we're looking at whether or not we want soul, how would we find soul in a chart? Well, soul technically we look at, because of Jeffrey Wolf Green, we might look at Pluto, which gives you an idea of soul. Now, each astrologer is going to have soul be attributed to some other part of the chart. Now, I attribute Pluto to shadow. So if I want to talk about shadow, I would look at connections between Black Moon Lilith and Pluto, because it would give me a really good idea of what is in shadow. And if I want to know about what emotions are in part of that shadow, I would look at the Moon and Pluto, because that archetype is another form of shadow, but it's on the emotional realm. And Black Moon Lilith and Pluto is what is repressed, the repressed self. Okay, so those are some archetypes that I would look at when I'm looking at the shadow. And in fact, Pluto talking to any planet would give you an idea. So Pluto and Mercury, you're going to see your shadow mentally. What mental projections? Because these are blind spots. They're out of sight, per se. So if we're looking at Pluto, the shadow, we're looking at projections. We're looking at, well, technically, let me take a step back. Mental blind spots, things that are outside of where we can see them, hidden. So what thoughts are we constantly thinking repetitively, habitually? It's our mind, the shadow of our own mind, creating a narrative that may not work out for us. If Pluto and the Moon are involved, the Moon is a mirror. It's a mirror. And what that basically means is that projections. So a person with Moon, Pluto in conversation is someone dealing with those projections not just emotionally, but they're also having to deal with their projecting onto others, but others also projecting onto them. More than likely, I see it as more that people are projecting onto this native. So this person, with this hypothetical person, with this Moon-Pluto connection, is dealing with other people projecting things onto them. And a projection basically is where someone doesn't see a trait or an archetype or a characteristic within themselves, and since they can't see it, they tend to project it onto others. And it could be positive, negative, it doesn't matter. It is still a projection. So when we all see someone we're like, oh, so-and-so is so confident, they're always, they're warm and engaging and confident, and that could be seen as projection, especially if there's a pattern of behavior behind this person in their past in which they've said something similar about other people previous to meeting this hypothetical person I've just mentioned. Okay? So archetypes can serve to give, as I said, shape and form to that which we understand the least. Now we have Mercury sextile Venus. And so Mercury, the thinker, Venus, the harmonizer, are talking together. What would that conversation look like? Well, that means that if a person, hypothetically, with this particular archetypal energy at work in their chart, a tendency to be more agreeable, a tendency to look to build bridges between themselves and other people ideologically, and also a tendency to see other people's points of view, and also maybe be a little bit more diplomatic in how they communicate, and a bit more accommodating when, maybe listening to others or listening to other people's points of view. Also, the shadow part of this is an overcorrection in that same direction, and also an overcorrection to the opposite way, whereas they are more independent, they're more not as willing to hear other people's points of view, they may be less diplomatic, because these are skills they're probably still trying to learn. Okay? So Mercury is thinking energy, and Venus is harmonizing energy. And so it's also a tendency to also rose-colored glasses sometimes. And I would also say that when we bring the dreamer, Neptunian type energy in. Because when we're bringing in dreamy, mystic energy, we got someone with Mercury and Neptune having a conversation, archetypally, the thinker and the dreamer. We got someone who is imaginative, sensitive, and might be just a little otherworldly. And so probably maybe a great storyteller, someone very idealistic, perhaps a poet, like that myth with Eurydice and Orpheus. Orpheus and Eurydice, he would be the poet. So Mercury in a sextile, or Mercury in any kind of connection, for example. Any connection, whether it's a square, whether it's a conjunction, etc. Mercury and Venus, that would be harmonizing energy. Mercury and Neptune tends to be dreamy energy, fantastical, imaginative, and an archetype in a story would be Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was madly in love with his wife Eurydice. All his poems, all of his songs, he was considered the best artist of his day and of his time, were for the love of this woman. But then one day she dies, and he's heartbroken. He doesn't know how he can go on without her. And so he makes a deal with Hades in one telling of the story, and he's allowed to go and retrieve her, but he's told to continue to walk until they get into the daylight. But he's never to turn around to look to see if she's behind. He's meant to trust that she is there and to keep walking towards the light. Now, in some tellings of the story, he's curious and he turns around, or in other tellings, he turns around because he just wants to see her. And the third, he didn't trust that she was there, so he turns around to make certain, and in doing so, she goes back to the nether realms, meaning where dead people go, and he goes on into the light alone. So depending on which retelling of the story we're looking at, there would be a very different moral, because most of these myths and folklore were about morals. Putting that aside, we're looking at Mercury, Neptune, that archetypal energy at play in this particular myth. Okay, so I think that will wrap it up for today. So next week, I'm going to be stepping into the inner planets as archetypes. This was only meant to wet the whistle here, to give us an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, and potentially, get a deeper understanding of ourselves, because the whole point of archetypal astrology is to use archetypes to better understand and comprehend ourselves, and in particular allow us to engage with our inner world with a great deal more clarity, groundedness. Okay? That is the whole point. I believe everybody has an inner code, and I think we should be living according to that code, or that worldview, or that philosophy, etc. And the best way to do that is to better understand yourself and to make choices from that place. Also, it's best if you can trust yourself. And if you know yourself well, you trust, I do this and I don't do that, or at least I don't make a habit of doing that, or I make a focus of trying to mitigate that behavior as much as I can, etc. I don't advocate trying to fix yourself, I really don't. And so I think archetypal astrology is useful in that it allows us to tell stories and tell narratives, and I find that stories and narratives, which the same thing, is a way of understanding ourselves and exploring ourselves in a way that's less painful. Okay? So, until next week, keep your feet on the ground and your eyes to the stars. Peace and astral magic.